from. That's where jobs and goods and services come from. And if the government's going to deprive the economy of that capital because it's borrowing it, that's worse than taxing it. So we've got to get a handle on government. Understand that government only exists because we're supporting it. And the government has to be small. See, America became a very wealthy country, a prosperous country, because we understood that. Because we kept government small. Taxes were low. Regulations were few. And we became the wealthiest country in the history of the world because we restrained our government. The problem is now the government has broken those restraints. It's run amok. We're now a high-taxed, high-regulated economy. We're the world's biggest debtor nation. We have huge current account deficits, huge trade deficits. We have no domestic savings. The reason that we need to sell our bonds to the Japanese and the Chinese is because we don't have any savings of our own. And the big problem with the national debt, and nobody talks about this, and our leaders are making the exact same mistakes that individuals made with their subprime mortgages. We've got an adjustable rate mortgage on the national debt. We don't borrow for 30 years. We borrow for 30 days. 1/3 of the national debt matures in a year. The entire maturity on the national debt is 3 years. So we've got a 3-year adjustable rate mortgage on a $14 trillion debt. Now, right now, we can afford the teaser rate because interest rates are zero. But what happens, when Paul Volcker became president, when Paul Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman under Reagan, interest rates went up to 20%. Now, do you think Paul Volcker wanted rates to be? Do you think he was happy about that? Do you think he sat down and thought, what would be a good place to put interest rates? At 20%. He did it because it was necessary to break the back of inflation, to save the dollar. Well, what if we have to do that again? We have a bigger inflation problem now than we had then, and the dollar is going to be weaker. What if we had to raise interest rates even to 10%? Well, now we have to pay 10% on a $14, $15 trillion debt. Well, do the math. 10% of $15 trillion, that's $1.5 trillion. Where's the government going to get that money? See, back in 1980, we didn't have that problem because the debt was 30 years. And if you look at the government's budget right now, the current budget deficit, the government is already spending $1.60 for every dollar it collects in taxes, and that's with interest rates at practically nothing. Imagine what happens when they go to a real level, which is the reason that the Fed is so reluctant to raise interest rates in the first place, because they know that the country would collapse with all the debt. The government would collapse, the banks would collapse, every single financial institution that they bailed out would fail again if interest rates went up. But the problem is, we can't run an economy with artificially low interest rates. It creates even bigger problems. No one's going to save if the interest on savings is zero, and if no one saves, there's no capital, there's no jobs. So we're going to keep on slowly destroying the economy until they eventually do the right thing. But the longer the wait, the worse it's going to get. Ultimately, personally, I don't think there's any way out of the debt. I think we have to restructure the debt. I think we really need to work with our creditors on a meaningful way to lengthen the maturities and restructure the principal. Because I don't think the American public can actually pay back this debt. It is too huge. And I think if we try to pay it back with a printing press, our creditors are going to be worse off than if we negotiate a real restructuring. But we need to do that in conjunction with all of our liabilities, because bigger than our funded debt is the unfunded liabilities. The liabilities of Social Security, of Medicare. I mean, you're talking, our total liabilities as a nation is in excess of $50 trillion, right? Our politicians have written checks that we can't cash. They did that to get reelected because it was easy. Promise people something for nothing, and that's how you get reelected. But they kept putting the price tag on future generations. And you know what? We're here. We're the ones that are left holding the bag. We have to deal with it right now. And if we want to sweep these problems under the rug, it's a bigger disaster. So we've got to handle them. We've got to bite the bullet now before it's a nuclear warhead.
Earlier you...
I'll let you finish your question, but we got to...
Okay. Earlier you mentioned some departments that you would eliminate. One of them was the Department of Education. If that were eliminated at the government level, how would that affect school budgets at our level, which seem to be continuing to grow and grow and grow?
Yeah, remember, the government doesn't get its money from another planet, right? The government gets its money from us. So to the extent that we can eliminate government programs and eliminate federal expenditures, that's more money. I mean, the state of Connecticut, as an example, and we're one of the worst states in the country as far as this goes. For every dollar the federal government takes away from us, we only get, I think, about 65 cents back. So for every dollar that I leave in Connecticut, right, it's that saves us 35 cents. So whatever money we're getting from Washington to help with education, if we just stop the spending, we'll have more money to educate ourselves. And I think all these problems are best left on the local level. That's what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. Education is not a federal issue. It's something that should be handled locally, at local governments. Because why is Washington making decisions for New Milford? I mean, why can't they be made here? Why are we having to send all of our money to Washington and then beg to get some of it back? I want the money staying here. But the real damage that the Department of Education has done has caused college costs to go through the roof. That's really what they've done. I mean, look at the Department of Agriculture. The biggest reason that the Department of Agriculture exists is to subsidize farmers to keep the price of food artificially high. That is the specific goal of our agriculture department, is to make food more expensive, to pay farmers not to farm their land, to put supports in there, and then you've got some things where you have the government spending money trying to encourage us not to smoke cigarettes, and then they're simultaneously subsidizing tobacco farmers to grow the tobacco that they don't want us to smoke. I mean, all this nonsense has to stop, and all this money spending has to stop. Because that's all. Washington is a growth industry. Right? It's just growing, as I said, like a cancer. And they're going to grow in perpetuity because that's what they do. Everybody tries to expand and grow their department and grow their power base. We have to put an end to it because it's never going to end on itself. It's just this self-perpetuating, monster. If you control it and starve it, then it's going to shrink. And as I said, we don't need all this. How can the government be twice as big? So they can say, well, we can't cut anything. Well, we can't get by on the amount of government we had in 2000? And the government was huge in 2000. How can that be? They always say, no, we need all this money that we're spending. They obviously don't need it. We need our money. I mean, the reason the economy is so weak is because we're broke. Right? We don't have the resources. Why are so many people unemployed? Why is nobody getting a job? Because the government is destroying those opportunities. It's because the bigger the government is, right, the more resources it takes away to sustain it. So we don't have those resources. They're not there for businesses to grow and expand. We don't have those opportunities. Imagine what would have to happen if the government actually raised taxes right now to cover the budget deficit. Can you imagine the tax increases that lay in store if we don't do something? Because ultimately, we're going to have to pay for all this government, one way or another. Either we're going to have to pay back the money we borrowed with interest, or we're going to print tremendous amounts of money, and the government's going to wipe everybody out. They're going to wipe out the middle class because our wages are going to have no value. They're going to wipe out our savings. They're going to wipe out our pensions because they destroy the dollar. There is no free lunch here. There is no way out of it. We have to, grab the bull by the horns and make these cuts. As far as I'm concerned, the only thing the federal government should really be doing is national defense. That's what their job is. The rest we can handle on a local level. They can run the courts, they can run, foreign embassies, but none of that costs very much. Right? The rest of it is just unconstitutional transfer payments from one American to another, and it's got to stop.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Very good.
My website, if anybody is interested in learning about the campaign, is SchiffForSenate.com, and my headquarters is in Milford. If anybody wants to, stop by, if anyone wants to volunteer or get more information on the campaign, you can do that here. I notice there's a few cards up here, maybe some in the back. Anyway, don't forget, debates are tomorrow night, so make sure to tune in.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yes,
All right, next we have Bill DeBale, who's here to speak for probate.